Today at 6, a new plan to reform the asylum system. Ministers claim it's the biggest overhaul in decades. The government says the system is being abused by illegal traffickers who make money putting people on boats or into containers.
Access to UK's asylum system should be based on need, not the ability to pay people smugglers.
The measures outlined today will do next to nothing to stop people making dangerous crossings, and they risk withdrawing support from desperate people.
We'll be looking at how other European countries deal with refugees. Also tonight, the COVID vaccine row. Now the EU says it may restrict exports to countries with higher jab rates. Is that aimed at us? Some parts of Liverpool Council will be run by government commissioners. It follows police investigations into accusations of corruption. John Lewis says it will close 8 more stores across the country, nearly 1,500 jobs at risk. Left a bit, right a bit. Marine experts try to reopen the Suez Canal after a massive container ship got stuck.
And coming up in Sports Day later in the hour on BBC News, 5 years after Wales' greatest triumph at a major tournament, they meet Belgium again, this time in World Cup qualifying.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. The Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has set out her plans to reform Britain's asylum system. That's the process under which people seek refuge here on the grounds that they're fleeing persecution in their home country. Ms Patel claims the process is being abused by illegal people smugglers who make money by trafficking those who can pay rather than those most in need of sanctuary here. So, what's her proposal? If people arrive here illegally, for example taking boats across the channel, the new plan will make it much harder for them to claim asylum and stay in the UK. But those who arrive here using what she calls legal settlement routes, such as being transferred formally from a refugee camp, will find it easier to get permission to stay in the country. But there's been severe criticism of these proposals, which have yet to be put to Parliament. The charity Refugee Action says the new scheme chooses people on the basis of how they get here, rather than the threat of persecution they face. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, June Kelly.
Dover today. The latest arrivals heading to shore after being picked up in their flimsy inflatable. Like so many, they've paid thousands to the people smugglers. Over the past year, patrol boats have found families with day-old babies and a pensioner of 97. During the last 12 months, 8,500 people crossed the channel in this way. The majority of them claimed asylum, and this is what the Home Secretary wants to stop.
Wait, I will bring the knife for you.
Jihad and Gina arrived in Britain from Syria under an official resettlement scheme. They've made their home in Preston with their 2 young sons. They'll always be grateful for the support they received right from the start.
They provide lots of help. They show us the local area. They were doing lots of support and help.
During the pandemic, Jihad used his skills as a tailor to make hospital garments.
Well, the hard work, he made me proud. I'm so proud of him.
I have to return the favor for this country, for the British people.
The Home Office introduced us to this couple, but stopped us from asking them any questions about their fellow Syrians who travel to this country on lorries and boats. The sort of migrants the Home Secretary was focusing on in the Commons today.
Our system is collapsing under the pressure of parallel illegal routes to asylum, facilitated by criminal smugglers. The existence of parallel routes is deeply unfair, advancing those with the means to pay smugglers over those in desperate need.
The reality is, the measures outlined today will do next to nothing to stop people making dangerous crossings, and they risk withdrawing support from desperate people.
So how does the UK compare when it comes to numbers claiming asylum? Well, in 2020, the figure here was just over 36,000. For the rest of Europe, in Germany, it was nearly 122,000. In France, more than 90,000. Italy, lower than the UK at 26,000, with Spain at more than 88,000.
There is an international law.
Zigazki Michael is now a British citizen, after claiming asylum when he arrived here on a lorry. He works and volunteers with the charity Citizens UK. In his native Eritrea, he was a judge. He fled after being imprisoned for refusing to compromise on his judicial independence. He doesn't believe he broke the law in the way he came to Britain.
Refugees don't have a choice, an option. Sometimes to save life, you have to do something extraordinary. To stop criminals make money should not compromise the right of refugees to get a sanctuary.
So while many migrants say this is their only option, the message from ministers is that they will not be welcome if they arrive in this way. June Kelly, BBC News.
And our political correspondent Damien Grammaticas joins us now from Westminster. Damien, you probably heard plenty of criticism of these plans, but it's worth remembering they've yet to become law.
Yes, that's right, George. These are proposals, and there are serious questions that are being asked about them. So one of those is that how would the UK manage this idea of returning people who had come through illegal routes? What the UNHCR have been saying today is that refugees are able to continue on a journey. They don't have to claim refugee status in the first country they reach if, for example, they're trying to reunite with a family. So the UK may have grounds to return people, but then that depends on having agreements with the countries they're sent back to. Priti Patel today said those are under negotiation. The other thing she was questioned about was the possibility of safe routes, and MPs saying to her, but they don't exist at the minute. There have been small schemes for a few thousand Syrians. She said those too would need to be created, so many details to be worked out.
Damien, thank you very much. There are fears that new EU proposals on restricting vaccine exports to non-EU countries could affect the rollout of the jabs here in Britain. Under plans to be put to EU leaders tomorrow, exports of vaccines from factories inside the EU could depend on the vaccination rate in the importing country. In other words, a country with a high rate might have to wait longer. As our Europe editor Katja Adler reports, these proposals come against a backdrop of EU countries struggling to meet their vaccination targets.
A brutal third wave, desperate lockdown protests, a deadly failure so far to get vaccines into arms. EU COVID woes are deepening by the day. Today, Angela Merkel, normally seen as the European symbol of calm and control, seemed to crumble under mounting political pressure.
Dritte Welle der Pandemie zu bremsen.
Germany has to stop the third wave of the pandemic, she said, but she changed her mind about an announced Easter lockdown. A personal mistake, she said. Across the EU, there's growing frustration at a vaccine rollout far slower than the UK's. Some blame their government, others the European Commission. It's now on the defensive, accusing pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca of not delivering vaccines promised and demanding extra controls on vaccine exports.
We ordered 120 million doses. We got only 30 million in Q1. If AstraZeneca had delivered exactly the number of doses which was planned, like they did in the UK, we will be today exactly at the same rate of vaccination as the UK. So we have been heavily penalized, heavily.
It seems with the new proposals, you're actually penalising countries that have been successful with their vaccine rollout, unlike the EU.
No, I really think that there's nothing against anybody, and especially not the UK.
The EU says it's already exported over 40 million jabs in the last 2 months, a quarter of those to the UK. Existing controls, used only once so far, allow the EU to block the export of vaccines made by companies that owe deliveries to Brussels. The new powers could target exports to wealthy countries that produce vaccines themselves but aren't exporting to the EU, or where the vaccine rollout is significantly ahead of the EU. We're not after an export ban, says the Commission. We just want to secure vaccine supply. But the world outside is accusing the EU of vaccine nationalism, and not even all EU leaders are convinced about these new controls. Some worry they'll disrupt the global supply chain for vaccines, and others that it will further damage already strained post-Brexit relations with the UK. Ahead of their summit, EU leaders promise vaccine supplies will soar from next month, one way or another. But rising death and infection rates means the short term looks bleak. In the UK, George, the Prime Minister has been very careful not to get dragged into a public row with the EU over vaccines. And in recent days, there have been high-level contacts between both sides. Just a few moments ago, we've seen a joint EU-UK statement on vaccines where they both recognise their interdependency and say they're trying to work on concrete steps in the short, medium and long term how they can better cooperate over jabs.
Katya, thank you very much. Earlier, Boris Johnson said he hadn't ruled out retaliation measures if the EU does end up preventing the export of vaccines to the UK. The Prime Minister, answering MPs' questions on COVID this afternoon, also suggested pub landlords could demand that customers prove they've been vaccinated. Here's our political editor, Laura Koonsberg.
Not exactly your normal commute.
Are we being greedy with our vaccines, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister leaving the House, not just for questions from the opposition, but the regular pummelling from Parliament's senior MPs. And with the EU dangling the threat of tighter controls on exporting the all-important vaccine, how would Boris Johnson respond?
If British lives were at risk, do you rule out taking measured and proportionate retaliation to discourage the EU from impeding legally binding contracts for our vaccines?
I think that the long-term damage done by blockades can be very considerable.
You're not taking anything off the table in terms of a British response to decisions this week.
Our priority is to continue the vaccine rollout, to vaccinate the British people. We'll do everything necessary that we can to ensure that happens.
With virus cases rising on the continent, MPs wanted to know, why aren't border controls being tightened further and faster now?
Is going in the other direction.
And that has
testing arrangements in place for hauliers going to France.
And that has to be balanced.
Technology made the exchanges more testy than normal, but the Prime Minister hinted tougher rules might come.
Why have you not introduced then additional measures or put France on the red list?
In terms of putting France on the red list, which is what you're talking about, and with the consequences that would have for UK supplies and for cross-channel movements, but it is something that we will have to look at. We will have to look at tougher measures.
Then what may rile his backbenchers? The Prime Minister seemed to approve of the idea that vaccines could in some circumstances become a compulsory part of life.
It doesn't seem to me to be irresponsible at all far from it. It's wholly responsible for care home companies to think of requiring vaccination.
What about a certificate for going to the pub?
It may be up to individual publicans. It may be up to the landlord.
But grappling with the pandemic is still a huge job for the government.
Loading, 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 loading.
Total number who have died is now 126,382. As for vaccinations, more than 325,000 people have had their first dose of a COVID vaccine in the latest 24-hour period, bringing the total to more than 28.5 million people, more than half of the adult population. Over 2.5 million people have had both doses of the vaccine. In a rare intervention, the government has decided to appoint commissioners to oversee some functions of Liverpool City Council for at least 3 years. Local Government Secretary Robert Jenrick said a report had shown a picture of mismanagement at the council which put public funds at risk. This latest move follows a police investigation into the way the council handled building and development contracts. Those under investigation deny any wrongdoing. Judith Moritz reports now from Liverpool.
The famous liverbirds have long watched over Liverpool. Now the city will also be overseen by the government, which will monitor parts of the council. The local government secretary, Robert Jenrick, said a damning inspector's report had found multiple failures.
It paints a deeply concerning picture of mismanagement, the breakdown of scrutiny and accountability, a dysfunctional culture putting the spending of public funds at risk and undermining the city's economic development.
Inspectors found an overall culture of intimidation, saying some whistleblowers were too frightened to be publicly identified. They say the council needs a reset, and so independent commissioners will work with the current chief executive to make improvements.
How can you give the people of Liverpool the confidence that this is going to be sorted out?
We fully accept the recommendations. We're not hiding from that at all, and we are absolutely determined to put these issues right and re-earn the respect of the people of Liverpool and all of the partners and stakeholders that we work with.
Merseyside police are also investigating building and development contracts. 5 men were arrested last year, including the former mayor, Joe Anderson, who denies any wrongdoing and has not been charged with any offences. The current acting mayor says local politicians will still have a say.
It's not a takeover of the city, as some of the media were proposing earlier in the week. It's commissioners coming in to oversee and observe the role of that department at this point in time. I think the Secretary of State was really clear, though. You know, if we were not cooperative with that, then further tougher measures would have been taken.
The Liberal Democrats say the post of city mayor should be abolished altogether. So what do Liverpudlians think about the government getting involved?
Are you bothered by who's ultimately in charge here?
As long as Liverpool gets its funding or however it gets helped, then I don't mind either way.
I wouldn't like the government in London to take over and say, oh, you can't do this or you can't do that, because they don't live here.
I think they should at least come in and just sort it all out and move back on, you know what I mean? Because it's gone on for years, this, in Liverpool.
There'll be checks on the council's progress every 6 months. The government expects its intervention to last for a minimum of 3 years. Judith Moritz, BBC News, Liverpool.
And the time is 17 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. A new plan to reform the asylum system. Ministers claim it's the biggest overhaul in decades. And still to come, we take a look at what it's like preparing for the delayed Olympics during the pandemic.
Coming up on Sports Day in the next 15 minutes on BBC News, a Champions League blow for Manchester City's women. They'll have to overturn a 3-0 defeat in the first leg of their quarter-final against Barcelona.
For the first time, NHS frontline doctors have been speaking about the huge numbers of COVID patients that had to be moved around the country during the second wave of the pandemic. An unprecedented 2,300 intensive care patients were transferred between hospitals because of bed shortages. 2 were moved 300 miles. The NHS says the transfers helped prevent some regions being overwhelmed. Our health correspondent said...
Loading, 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 loading.
Care bed shortages. Ashley Harvey, a chauffeur, was one of them. The week in January, when he was admitted to the Royal Stoke Hospital with breathing difficulties, was the peak of the pandemic for the NHS. Days later, despite being in an induced coma and on a ventilator, he was transferred to hospital in Salford, 1 hour away, to make room for a surge of patients coming up from the south.
I'm aware that they had 9 patients come from London. They were having displacement patients coming into the hospitals up and down the country.
And so...
Loading, 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 loading.
300 critically ill patients were moved around the UK because ICUs were so full. 1 in 8 patients had to be moved from hotspots in London and the Midlands. More than a quarter of patients went on longer journeys. The BBC has learned among the furthest were West Midlands to Devon, 160 miles, Birmingham to Newcastle, 200 miles, and Surrey to Tyne and Wear, 300 miles.
Moving critically ill patients and on this unprecedented scale required exceptional expertise because it's so high risk. Back last summer, medical staff who saw bed shortages coming raced to train specialist transfer teams, source ambulances and medical equipment.
This doctor was instrumental in setting up the operation in London.
No one wants their patients to be taken away from them to complete their journey of care at another centre, but they also were very acutely aware that was the only option to preserve access to life support. When we were taking patients across from hospitals that were close to the critical levels of oxygen supply or the last ventilated bed to hospitals that were under somewhat less pressure, was absolutely life-saving.
We're still a little bit over 100% capacity.
In Birmingham, doctors told me at its worst, a staggering 40% of intensive care patients in some hospitals had to be moved, and that without the transfers, more would have died.
We would have seen scenes like Northern Italy, where at one point hospitals were overwhelmed and they were talking about triaging by age. Scenes like New York, where
loading,
angry that no one has taken responsibility for what he describes as catastrophic failures in the Scottish Government's investigation of sexual harassment complaints against him, and he's planning to take legal action against those who he thinks are to blame. Now, he says he does accept the findings of the independent inquiry that ruled Nicola Sturgeon had not breached any ministerial rules, and the Holyrood Committee, which found serious flaws in the Scottish Government's processes. But he's not going to leave it there. He is going to launch a court action over concerns about the Permanent Secretary, Leslie Evans. She's the most senior civil servant in the Scottish Government. And he's going to make a formal complaint to the police about a leak to a newspaper, because he wants the police to try and uncover who within the Scottish Government passed details of the complaints against him to the press. But after that, he says he will make no further public comment, because it's time to move on and look forward to Scottish elections in just 6 weeks' time.
Sarah, thank you very much. John Lewis has said it will not reopen a further 8 stores after the lockdown. The retail giant, which recently reported big losses, says certain locations can't sustain a large store. The move puts nearly 1,500 jobs at risk. A warning our business correspondent Emma Simpson's report does contain flashing images.
3, 2, 1.
It wasn't that long ago John Lewis was still doing this. Opening new department stores.
Morning, John Lewis, Exeter.
Nearly doubling in size in a decade. They're reining back rapidly now. Today, another 8 to close. From Ashford in Kent, one of 4 smaller John Lewis shops.
Loading.
It didn't surprise me.
John Lewis was so important to Sheffield that the council paid it more than £3 million to effectively keep it here. It signed a new 20-year lease just last summer as part of a wider regeneration plan. But it's now done a handbrake turn.
The shift online has been unprecedented. There are some areas of the country which, sad as it is, we can't any longer profitably sustain the size of store we've got today.
But have they been too hasty?
Wide. This canal connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean is 150 years old, but crucial for modern global trade. The Ever Given ran aground at 5:40 on Tuesday morning. It's one of 52 ships a day that travel through this passage of water. They carry 12% of global trade, worth over £2 billion. So, will there be a price to pay?
We think about exports from China.
they will take about 10% longer in terms of shipping time to arrive at their destination. And when we think about the importance of Chinese products for the production of goods all over the world, we have to be worried that this will have major consequences.
They're hoping tugboats, diggers and the tide will refloat the ship, but it could take weeks to deal with the consequences. However mighty the forces of globalisation, we're all vulnerable to the whims of nature. Darshini David, BBC News.
Preparing for the Olympics requires stamina and determination at the best of times, so imagine doing it in the year of the pandemic. Katrina Johnson-Thompson started on the athletics track as a child in Liverpool, and now the reigning world heptathlon champion is counting down to her third Olympics in Japan this summer. Sally Nugent reports.
Katrina Johnson-Thompson of Liverpool. She's the world champion.
Years of work and preparation. Reaching the peak of her capabilities at just the right time, Katarina Johnson-Thompson had to put the brakes on when last year's Olympics was postponed.
It's literally got halted. There's going to be so many people who would have been Olympic champion who isn't going to be an Olympic champion because of this pandemic, and I find that fascinating. I think the Olympics will be won and lost on whoever's handled the pandemic the best.
Over the last 12 months, Johnson-Thompson has wanted to give something back and has now set up her own academy. She wants to help young athletes who she feels are at risk of dropping out.
They have to be from a diverse ethnic background. They have to be, state schooled and at that county level competition. So I feel like they're the groups who need most help. You think there's a lot of people and young athletes out there who could be in the Olympic team, could be winning Olympic medals, but just haven't had the right support along the way.
The world champion has worked hard to protect herself from the mental pressures of a year in lockdown.
I think social media with its pressures as well, it is self-care sometimes to just log off or mute or, unfollow.
This could be a gold medal winning jump.
Even with the delay and the difficulties of the last year, what's it like going into an Olympic Games as world champion in your event?
For me, knowing that, for a number of years I didn't think that I could ever win on that sort of global.
Loading, 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 loading.
That's my sort of beliefs, I know that it's a strong chance that I could be outperformed, but as long as I do my best, and I have no regrets.
The Olympics will look different this year. No overseas fans or families in the crowd. But Katarina Johnson-Thompson will be ready. Sally Nugent, BBC News.
The weather now with Sarah Keith Lucas. Hello.
Hi there, George. Well, we've had a bit of blue sky, spring sunshine out there today. This was the picture in Nottingham a little bit earlier on. And over the next few days, a bit more sunshine to come, but also a scattering of showers. And we're all going to notice things turning colder briefly by the time we get to Friday. For the here and now, there's a weather front that's been pushing across parts of southeast England and East Anglia, bringing a bit of cloud. That should push away. So clearing skies across southern and eastern parts of England. Further north across England and Wales, a little bit more cloud and patchy rain sinking south tonight. And for Scotland and for Northern Ireland, more of those showers packing.
Loading, loading, loading.
Another day of sunshine and showers. The bulk of those showers will be across Northern Ireland, Scotland and northwest England. But later in the day, we'll see a few of those showers cropping up across southern and southeast England as well. But in between those two areas, drier weather with some sunshine and temperatures up to around 13 or 14 degrees. Moving through then Thursday night and into Friday, it is going to be all change as an active weather front tracks its way eastwards. That's going to open the door for this colder air to work in. So I think Friday, quite a shock to the system. There's going to be initially some cloud and rain across England and Wales working its way eastwards, and then followed by some clear spells, but also some showers that could be a little bit wintry over the higher ground for parts of Highland Scotland, perhaps down towards Snowdonia, for instance, as well. And gusts of wind around 30 to 40 miles per hour, perhaps even stronger than that. So a colder day, but warmer again by the weekend. George.
Sarah, thank you. And that's it. Now on BBC One, we can join the BBC's news teams where you are. Goodbye.